Sanctuary. Sanctuary is the practice of shielding aliens in the United States in violation of law from the reach of federal immigration officers. Once upon a time, it was a small, isolated practice, usually undertaken by church groups such as the Friends, who would shelter a family, two families, somewhere in the sanctuary of their church. And some years ago, that changed. It kind of transmogrified, and what we see now is sanctuary in literally hundreds of different jurisdictions in the United States, cities, counties, even some states, California and Oregon come to mind, to some extent the state of New York. And sanctuary is, according to the advocates, is one of the ways in which governments preserve the trust of their immigrant communities. What they argue is that by cooperating with federal immigration authorities, they erode the trust, and there are consequences for that. For instance, in running the risk of diminishing the number of people who as victims or witnesses are willing to speak to the police. The problem with that argument is that it's not only counterintuitive when you look at it in detail, but there is absolutely no empirical evidence to prove that that's the case. And in fact, to the extent that there have been studies, the studies show that there is no appreciable change in the reporting of crimes by victims or witnesses in sanctuary jurisdictions and jurisdictions that overtly work with the immigration authorities. And the reality is, truthfully, that when you consider sanctuary, sanctuary only shields alien criminals. There is no city, there is no county, there is no state that will ever be able to enact a law, a rule, a regulation, a policy that has the ability to prohibit federal agents from going about their business. They can make arrests on the street, they can make arrests in the workplace. When it's necessary, they can make arrests in the home. And so when you think about it, the only things that are under the control of state and local governments are places like penal institutions, jails, police stations. And so for all intents and purposes, practically speaking, the rules and regulations and laws that we're talking about prohibit police from cooperating with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, into taking into custody aliens who have already been arrested by those police for crimes. If you think about it that way, what basically the state or the city or the county is saying is that at the end of their dealings with that individual, they would rather put him back on the street into the immigrant communities from which they themselves arrested him for committing a crime than seeing him turned over to federal authorities for the purposes of being removed from the United States. And the reality is that as often as not, the people who are the victims and the witnesses to those crimes are people in the immigrant communities. If you think about large metropolitan areas, and frankly even in suburban places like Long Island, transnational gangs like the Latin Kings or MS-13, they're a plague upon the immigrant communities. They engage in extortion with immigrant business owners. They induce the young children, the young men in those communities to join their gangs either by luring or by threats. And so when the police engage in conduct that put those people right back into the community, they are not well serving that community at all. The argument just doesn't hold that somehow that preserves the trust of the immigrants. It just doesn't wash. It has also led to a great irony in that some of the jurisdictions that accrue the most benefit from federal grants, federal law enforcement and even Homeland Security grants, are those that engage in sanctuary policies. They accrue tens of millions of dollars a year. And one prime example is the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program. This program was enacted originally by Congress as a way of recognizing that when alien criminals are in the community, that it is in some sense an indicator of failed immigration policies, and that because these individuals are going to be arrested, placed into county jails, and then into state penal institutions at cost to those jurisdictions, that the federal government should then bear some of the fiscal costs and apportion money to those state and county and city law enforcement and correctional officials to help offset that. But this was done with the notion that then federal immigration officers would be there to pluck those people out of the institutions at the moment of release so that they could be evicted from the United States through removal. And so now you have the irony that some of these jurisdictions and the monies from even though it's called the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program, it actually is apportioned to states, counties, and cities. You have sanctuary states, sanctuary counties, and sanctuary cities collecting millions of dollars for aliens that are in the United States in violation of law who were supposed to be removed, and instead of turning them over to ICE, they put them back on the street, but they still insist on taking the money, which was supposed to be for the purpose of offsetting a federal failure in law. But the federal government doesn't exist in a vacuum. Federal agents can't do that kind of work without the cooperation necessary from those state and local police agencies and those state and local correctional organizations. It just can't happen. Jeff Sessions, former Senator Jeff Sessions, who is now the Attorney General, attempted to take that in hand by declaring that a whole host of federal grant monies that are overseen by the Justice Department would no longer be provided to sanctuary jurisdictions, and the basis that he used were two provisions in federal law. One at 8 U.S.C. section 1373 and one at 8 U.S.C. section 1644. They read very, very similarly, and in each case what they say is that no federal, state, or local entity is allowed to prohibit or otherwise interfere with the exchange of information between the federal government and an employee over the immigration status of an individual. And keep in mind it's a two-way street. It is also a requirement that the federal government provide information on aliens when asked by a state or local government entity. Most of the organizations that have enacted sanctuary policies or even laws have throwaway language in there to the effect of, except as otherwise prohibited by federal law. And then they go about making sure that there is absolutely no way that there are any of their employees who are going to provide that information, which seems to me pretty conclusive evidence that that phrase is really, it's a fig leaf. It's not legitimate. And what's more, because state and local employees know who provides their salaries, know who provides their yearly, their appraisals, who are they going to listen to? You know, if the sergeant in the jail says to you, as an alien is booked in, you're not going to provide any information about this individual, are you? Well, of course, then you're going to say, no, I'm not, because you run the risk of being disciplined. And so this has resulted in a drying up of exchanges of information between the federal immigration officers, usually ICE, as I mentioned, and state and county and city jails, where it seems to me that the exchange is the most important, because what you're talking about is aliens who have already shown a proclivity to violate criminal laws. These are the people that ICE wants to focus on and that ICE should focus on. And it is not only just an exchange of information, but these jurisdictions refuse to accept ICE detainers. Detainers are a hold. It's a common thing in law enforcement that when one organization takes into custody an individual, and not just an alien, and another organization becomes aware of it, and they do become aware of it, they file a detainer and ask the holding police agency, when you're done with him, give him to us. Happens all over the United States. It's even provided for through interstate compacts. It's provided for with every other organization of the federal government except ICE. The Marshal Service files holds routinely. DEA files holds routinely. The FBI files holds routinely. They will even honor holds filed by the military for people who are suspected of being deserters or AWOL. Of course they do. And yet they argue that they shouldn't be undertaking immigration work, even though there are valid reasons to believe that they are assisting the immigrant communities by doing so. The reason, just to digress for a moment, that ICE knows to file those detainers or to ask information is because these days, when you take the fingerprints of someone who's being booked in, those fingerprints are transmitted electronically first to what's called the State Identification Bureau and then forwarded from there to the FBI, to the Criminal Justice Information System, the big NCIC computer in the sky. If there is a match with prior criminal records, that shoots back to the holding agency. If that person is wanted, that's what shoots it to another police organization so that they will know to file a hold. But the NCIC computer also shoots it to Department of Homeland Security, which does a match with its biographic databases, mostly fingerprints. And if that individual is known to be an alien illegally in the United States, the information is shot down to the local ICE field office in near real time, so they know that individual is in the custody of that police organization, that sheriff's office, or if it happens to be a penitentiary on being moved. They're aware that the individual is there, and that's when they file the detainer and they ask for the release date, the earliest possible release date, so that they can be there at the jail door to take the person into custody. But once a sanctuary policy or law has kicked in, all of that goes away. It just disappears. And that leaves ICE in the position of having to do follow-up investigations on the street to locate the individual once they become aware that he's passed his release date and he has been put back into the community. And this is another way in which, frankly, the entire community, but especially the immigrant community, is at risk, because when ICE has to undertake these kinds of follow-up investigations to take people into custody, it's not in a safe, confined environment like a jail. Any street arrest involves risk. It involves risk for the person being arrested. It involves risk for the officers. It involves risk for bystanders. And if you're talking about someone who was arrested for a violent crime to begin with, there is every reason to think that that person is going to resist being taken into custody by ICE when they find him on the street. And there is also the reality that it often results in collateral arrests. When ICE takes into custody someone that they could not arrest at the jail because they weren't told and their detainer was ignored, if they figure out where that guy's at, they identify him, they locate him, and he's in a house, when they go take him into custody in that house, they are obliged to take into custody everybody that's in the house if those people have no papers. And as a consequence, if you take the one guy that they would have been able to accept at the jail that they really wanted, they may have another 4 people that are illegally in the United States that have not had negative interactions with the law, but they go too. Those agents don't have much choice about the matter. It's not like they can turn a blind eye to people that they encounter in that house. And they have to know when they go to make an arrest, whether it's at the workplace or at the residence, who they're dealing with. They would be absolutely insane not to find out who they're dealing with, because it's their lives that are at risk when they take these people into custody. This is the actual reality of what happens as the result of sanctuary policies. No one is safer for it. And then you also have the reality that if an alien believes that ICE is going to be hot on his trail, he's not going to go directly back to that jurisdiction necessarily. he's going to find some other place to perch where he thinks the chance of finding him is less. So he may drift from one jurisdiction to another, and he may get picked up frequently along the way with ICE always a step behind him, and sometimes with horrible consequences. And we have seen this time after time after time, that you have people with a running history of criminal arrests or multiple prior deportations. It resulted in the murder quite some time ago now of Kate Steinle in San Francisco. And that was an instance where the man was in ICE custody, and ICE, as a courtesy, notified the San Francisco Police Department, we picked up a guy and there's an outstanding warrant. Would you like to take him into custody? Police department took him from ICE. The DA then dismissed the charges, and the police refused to give him back, even though ICE had given him to them to begin with. That's why he was on the street, and that's why he was on the pier the day that he shot that young woman to death in the arms of her dad. You had the same thing happen recently with Molly Tibbetts being murdered by a fellow in Iowa. She was just graduated from her, not graduated, but completed her first year of college. She was killed by a man who had no business being in the United States. It happens with great frequency. Ironically, even in California, 2 sheriff's deputies were murdered by an illegal alien and as a direct consequence of California's own Trust Act. That fellow, I believe, ultimately made bond and was released because they wouldn't honor a detainer, even though it was their own deputies who had been shot and killed in the shootout between the guy.